They say no one heard the screaming. No footsteps, no blood. Just snow perfect, untouched, virginal. 4 wives disappeared from the Utah wilderness in the dead of winter, 1847. And the only man who could answer for it told a story colder than the mountain air. But the snow lies. And so did he. This is not just a story of a missing family. It's a blueprint for the dark architecture of power, of what happens when ideology turns flesh into sacrifice, when isolation becomes doctrine, and when one man believes his revelation is holier than life itself. You're not just here to hear what happened to Ezekiel Whitmore's wives. You're here to uncover why it was buried. Utah territory was a land both promised and forsaken, a crucible for the faithful, a prison for the unwanted. By the winter of 1847, Brigham Young's followers had already become mythic figures in their own time, desperate souls carving a city from rock and starvation in pursuit of a heaven no one else believed in. But the truth was darker, far darker. They came west to escape persecution, but some brought it with them. They were building Zion with nails, blood, and secrets. Ezekiel Whitmore came in the second wave, a carpenter, a man of conviction, and 4 wives who followed him like petals in a storm. Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, each woman brought into the fold for theological perfection, for celestial reward. But beneath the robes and reverence, something else had already begun to stir in Ezekiel's mind. A vision. Not from God, but from something deeper, older, hungrier. In those early Mormon years, plural marriage wasn't just a rite, it was a structure of control. A woman's worth was in her womb, her obedience, her silence. But Ezekiel wasn't content with control. He needed sacrifice. A blood-bound offering to an unseen kingdom. They say he prayed too long, stared too long into the fire, built his cabin with stones so thick not even screams could escape. Visitors noted something off. Too much harmony among the wives. Movements in sync, eyes too quiet. Even the bishop who visited wrote of strange marks on their wrists. Identical, deliberate, hidden, under sleeves like they were part of some pact. But no one listened. No one ever does, until it's too late. December 19th, the last confirmed sighting. Sarah and Rebecca answered the door for hunters delivering meat. They declined an invitation for Christmas worship, said they'd pray alone that year. Alone, in that cabin of pine and stone. After that, silence. Just smoke from the chimney, and then nothing. Weeks passed. Then Ezekiel came to town. His story? That his wife Sarah had received a divine calling, one so urgent, she'd left in the middle of the coldest winter Utah had ever seen. On foot, to Missouri. A lie so absurd, even the bishop winced. But Ezekiel didn't stop there. One by one, the wives were said to have left. Each time with a different divine excuse. Each time alone. No witnesses. No farewells. Just gone. And behind the lies, the cabin waited still, cold, and watching. The bishop grew suspicious, of course. He visited. Found the house eerily empty. Not quiet like a home at peace, but hollow, like the soul had been scooped out. The hearth burned, but the food was wrong. Preserved, tasteless. The kind a man eats when there are no women to cook. Furniture untouched, rooms too clean. And a scent, faint but undeniable, earth, turned over in frozen ground. As if something had been buried in defiance of the snow. Later that night, one of the men swore he heard weeping beneath the floorboards. Let me pause you here. This isn't just an unsolved crime. This is a pattern. Men like Ezekiel don't vanish. They get absorbed into systems that need them. Protected by ideologies that reward obedience and punish questions. What happened in that cabin was never meant to be known. It was meant to be swallowed by time, by snow, by silence. But here's the truth. Institutions have always buried the evidence of their own darkness. And when the wolves come dressed as prophets, the sheep not only follow, they kneel. Because Blind obedience doesn't just create followers, it creates monsters. Are you beginning to see the blueprint? Every layer of this mystery is a mirror reflecting not just Ezekiel's madness, but the mechanisms that enabled it. A faith so focused on purity that it turned women into theology. A church so fearful of scandal it buried the truth beneath its own foundations. But the dead never stay buried. Not forever, because in 1920, the ground shifted, and what lay beneath the chapel's stone floor would force even the most faithful to look into the abyss. You're not just listening now. You're being pulled, and you're not alone if you feel the descent beginning. Comment this phrase twice. The snow remembers. The snow remembers. Let it mark your transformation. Let the algorithm and the truth bind, because this rabbit hole goes deeper, and what comes next will change how you see not just this story, but every story you've ever been told. Beneath every revelation is a secret, and beneath every secret lies a weapon. Ezekiel Whitmore was not simply a man shaped by faith. He was forged by a doctrine few dared to speak aloud. The principle of ultimate consecration. Sacrifice not as metaphor, but as mandate. Blood not as symbol, but as seal. You see, in the shadows of early Mormon theology, there existed whispers, murmurs among the zealous that God did not just ask for devotion. He demanded it in flesh. In public, the church preached the gospel of family, unity, and eternal progression. But behind closed doors, in private journals and unspoken sermons, some leaders circulated a darker gospel, a belief that certain sins could only be purged through the shedding of blood. Blood atonement. The idea that some transgressions were so severe that only death could redeem the soul. Now imagine this idea landing in the mind of a man already half mad with isolation. A man living alone with 4 wives in the heart of a frozen wilderness. A man whose mind had begun to confuse revelation with obsession. Ezekiel read everything, and not just the official teachings. He collected apocryphal texts, fragments of early Latter-day Saint writings, not meant for general circulation. Writings that spoke of spiritual hierarchies, eternal families sealed not just in temples, but in trials, in fire, in sacrifice. In his journals found decades later beneath the cabin floorboards, he describes visions, dreams of altars in the snow, flames that spoke, a voice calling itself the architect, that promised him glory beyond the veil if he would offer his family, not just his faith. These were not the ramblings of an uneducated man. Ezekiel was articulate, precise. His entries are organized, detailed, and horrifying. He believed he was chosen to fulfill a final ritual, one that would purify the land and prepare it for Zion, a blood-bound covenant between the earthly and the divine. And his wives? They weren't just victims, they were participants. At least, at first. In Rebecca's secret journal, unearthed long after her disappearance, there are early entries filled with hope. She writes of feeling called, of dreams that align with Ezekiel's, of preparing for some unknown task that would bring their family closer to God. But then, a shift. A quiet note of fear. She begins to question whether the source of Ezekiel's visions is divine at all. Her final entry, the last words she ever wrote, speak of a darker source than heaven. Let that sink in. A woman, living in complete isolation, surrounded by snow and silence, begins to fear that her husband's revelations are not from God, but something else entirely. And she's not wrong, because Ezekiel's descent mirrors something we've seen across time, something encoded in the DNA of countless historical tragedies. When men isolate themselves in power, unchecked by community, worshipped by family, and surrounded by ideologies that demand perfection, madness is not just possible. It's inevitable. Consider the blueprint again. Step 1. Isolation. Remove the man from society. Give him land, silence, space to hear only himself. Step 2. Absolute authority. Grant him wives who depend on him for survival. Embed his word as law in the home. He becomes father, husband, prophet, king. Step 3. Theology is control. Teach that obedience is salvation. That questioning is rebellion. That pain is purification. And step 4. The divine excuse. A vision, a calling. Something only he can. Here, now any act, no matter how monstrous, is sanctified. Now, let me ask you something direct. How many other times has this same structure been repeated in history? In Waco, in Jonestown, in isolated monasteries, remote compounds, hidden communes. The names change, the languages shift, but the pattern remains. Isolation plus ideology plus authority plus revelation equals ritual violence. That's the forbidden's formula. The one no religious institution will ever admit to creating. But it's been used for centuries, repackaged, redeemed, and deployed again and again. Ezekiel was a product of this system. But he wasn't an anomaly. He was its prototype. Let's go back to the cabin. After Sarah and Rebecca were declared gone, Ezekiel's behavior shifted. Witnesses recall that he stopped attending church meetings. He no longer traded goods. He rarely spoke. But in the bishop's journal, there's a single entry that chills the blood. Brother Whitmore arrived today in silence. His coat was wet, though there was no snow falling. His hands bore cuts in the shape of crosses. Let me explain what that means. Self-wounding in religious ritual isn't new. Across time, men have offered blood as a form of repentance or communion. But these wounds weren't on the palms. They were on the wrists, shaped like crosses, symbols of covenant, of sealing. Ezekiel had begun to treat his own flesh as scripture. Think about the psychological break that requires. To believe that your skin is a scroll, that your blood is a pen, and that God is reading. That's where the institutional manipulation kicks in, because the early Mormon church, like many religious structures, promoted secrecy under the banner of sacredness. It wasn't just what was taught, it was what was withheld. The principle of selective truth, only the worthy could hear. Deeper doctrine, only the faithful were told the full story. This gatekeeping of revelation breeds madness. When men are told that truth is exclusive, they begin to believe that whatever they hear must be true because they are chosen. So when Ezekiel heard voices in the wind, he didn't doubt. He wrote them down. He built his theology around them. And eventually, he enacted it. Let's talk about the night it happened. There are no witnesses, no records, only what was found later. But from Ezekiel's writings, we can piece together the ritual. He believed he was creating an eternal family bond through sacrifice. He fasted for 3 days. Then, one by one, he brought his wives into a small room beneath the cabin, originally meant for food storage. There, he performed what he called the binding. The details are too graphic to describe in full, but here's what matters. Each wife was dressed in white. Each was offered a final prayer. Each was told this was the only way to ensure they would reign together in the celestial kingdom, and each was bled. In his mind, he wasn't murdering them, he was exalting them. This is what happens when distorted theology is mixed with unchecked power. It doesn't just create victims, it turns love into violence, and family into offering. Now pause. Feel your chest. That pressure? That's the weight of recognition. Because what Ezekiel did in that cabin is echoed in boardrooms, war rooms, and spiritual centers across history. When institutions demand loyalty above truth, when ideology becomes more sacred than life, this is what we get: ritualized destruction. And it's not just ancient history. The same psychological frameworks are still alive, still used. Join this cause. Obey without question. Doubt is betrayal. Pain means progress. Sacrifice makes you holy. This is not just about religion. This is about control systems masquerading as salvation. You've seen it in schools, in corporations, in families, in cults. Method is always the same. If you want to own a person forever, make them believe their suffering has purpose. That's the lie Ezekiel told his wives. And it's the lie too many still believe today. Ask yourself, where have you been told to obey without questioning? Where have you been taught that pain is proof you're on the right path? Where have you sacrificed truth for belonging? It's time to see with open eyes. And if you're still here, still breathing through the heaviness in your chest, then you're ready for what comes next. Because the true mystery isn't what happened to Ezekiel's wives. It's what happened to him. He disappeared, yes, but not without trace. There are sightings, hints, rumors, and one piece of evidence so chilling, it was locked away by the church for nearly 70 years. We'll go there next, but understand, from here on out, there's no turning back. This isn't just history. This is initiation. They say the mind is sacred, a realm untouched by force. But what if that was never true? Imagine a room. No windows, no clocks. Only the hum of fluorescent lights and a clipboard on a stainless steel table. Inside, a child no older than 8 stares at a wall painted white, not knowing her name. Her memories gone. And across from her sits a man in a military coat, smiling like a priest before a sacrifice. "You're going to be useful, darling," he whispers. "This isn't fiction. This was a program, one of many, hidden, protected, funded, and buried beneath decades of denial. Welcome to the labyrinth of lies. At the center of this dark maze lies a project known as MK Ultra, a name that sounds like pulp sci-fi. But behind the scenes, it was America's most disturbing experiment in psychological warfare, launched by the CIA in the early 1950s and cloaked under Cold War paranoia. The goal? Not just to study the mind, but to own it. LSD, hypnosis, isolation tanks, sleep deprivation, electroshock therapy, even sexual abuse. All performed without consent. On prisoners, on patients, on citizens, on children. What began as a study to counter supposed Soviet brainwashing techniques quickly devolved into something more monstrous, a playground for control, power, and sadistic science masquerading as patriotism. But Mukhacho was only the tip of the iceberg. The deeper we go, the more the corridors of this labyrinth twist. Because what if you could erase a memory, or worse, replace it? This was the next frontier. In sub-projects buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and false trails, Monarch, Artichoke, Bluebird, the aim wasn't just manipulation, it was reprogramming. Taking a human being and rebuilding them from the inside out. Splitting personalities. Installing new identities. Creating assets. Victims, often referred to as survivors, now tell eerily similar stories. Fragmented dreams, trigger phrases. Doll-like obedience followed by explosive rage. They recall rooms filled with checkerboard floors, handlers dressed like doctors, rituals involving pain and rewards. And always the same phrase whispered over and over like a mantra: "This isn't real, you're just dreaming." But someone else was wide awake. Behind these programs stood architects, not just in lab coats, but in suits and uniforms. Funded by black budgets, protected by national security loopholes, and given moral immunity by a system that claimed the ends justified the means. Think tanks like the Tavistock Institute. Shadowy divisions within intelligence agencies. Even private contractors and psychiatrists who saw the human soul as clay. One must ask, what kind of society would not only permit such acts, but build entire institutions around them? And what was the endgame? Some say it was all about interrogation techniques. Others argue it was about creating perfect spies, people who could kill, lie, forget, and obey without question. But dig deeper and you find something even darker. The pursuit of total psychological domination. The transformation of a population into a compliant mass. If you can fracture the individual, shatter their identity, and rebuild them in your image, what can't you control? We saw glimpses of the fallout in the 1970s when the church committee hearings partially exposed Mecca Ultra, but most documents had already been destroyed under CIA Director Richard Helms. What survived were testimonies half redacted, hesitant, horrifying. Survivors began to come forward, but their stories were dismissed as delusions. Conspiracy theories, false memory syndrome, hysteria. A convenient diagnosis. When the truth is too dangerous, but the labyrinth wasn't sealed. It evolved. Fast forward to today, where reality bends, memory is digital, and control is algorithmic. The experiments never stopped. They just changed shape. Now, they wear the mask of entertainment. Social media, smart technology, behavioral nudges. Attention spans weaponized. Emotions tracked. Privacy evaporated. What the CIA once tried with LSD, Silicon Valley now achieves with dopamine loops, and yet, the core principle remains the same. Fragment the self to conquer the whole. Divide and rewire until the human being is no longer sovereign, but programmable. Replace faith with fear. Replace memory with myth. Replace instinct with impulse. So ask yourself, who benefits from a population that no longer trusts its own mind? This is not merely historical horror. It is a blueprint for modern life. And the architects never left. They simply moved to new labs with better funding, better PR, and global reach. Take Operation Mockingbird, for example. A CIA campaign to infiltrate and influence mass media. It began in the Cold War, but its logic never faded. Control the narrative, filter the truth, weaponize perception. And now, with 24/7's information streams, the labyrinth expands beyond institutions. It lives in your feed, your phone, your thoughts. In such a world, the most revolutionary act is remembering who you are. That your mind is not public domain. That trauma is not identity. That your silence is not consent. But the real question is, can you ever truly escape the labyrinth once you've seen it? Because once a mind has been broken, its echoes can last for generations. Epigenetic trauma, family systems torn apart, children raised in silence, grandchildren inheriting ghosts. The shadows of these experiments don't just haunt victims, they stain entire cultures. They alter how we love, how we fear, how we see ourselves. And worst of all, they teach us to doubt the truth even when we live it. What do you call a society where people can't tell dream from memory? Where children are programmed like computers? Where truth sounds like madness? You call it designed, and perhaps that was the point all along. Because at the heart of every dark system is one principle. If you control the story, you control the soul. The architects of psychological warfare understood this. They knew that pain can be rewritten, that identity can be bent, that a person can be both victim and weapon. And they tested this theory not on soldiers or enemies, but on civilians, on children, on you. So when you hear whispers about mind control, don't roll your eyes. Don't retreat into irony. Listen, because those whispers come from the cracks in the system, where truth bleeds out and tries to warn us. This isn't about paranoia. It's about pattern recognition, and the pattern is clear. A lie repeated becomes belief. A mind fractured becomes manageable, and a population manipulated becomes a commodity. The labyrinth isn't ancient. It's modern. It lives in data, in media, in the quiet compliance we mistake for peace. And at the center of that labyrinth is a mirror. What will you see when you look into it? Your reflection? Or the version they built? Let that question haunt you, because the next section dives even deeper into how religion, symbols, and ancient rites were blended with modern science to fracture minds on a spiritual level. We'll follow the breadcrumbs to ancient Babylon, Vatican archives, and mass rituals hiding in plain sight. And when we return, you'll never see a cathedral, a concert, or a commercial the same way again. They didn't just invade the mind, they colonized the soul, and this is only the beginning. They called it divine, sacred, eternal. But behind the curtain of incense and stained glass, behind the chants echoing through marble cathedrals and golden mosques, there was something far more calculated. This was not faith, not in the way the masses understood it. This was architecture, engineering, the construction of a perfect machine for obedience. In this section, we descend into the crypt, into the hollow chamber beneath centuries of scripture and tradition, to expose how empires used religion not to liberate souls, but to chain them. Long before Europe's thrones were united under banners of kingdoms and nations, they were already united by the Church. And not by accident. The Roman Catholic Church, rising from the ashes of a fallen empire, did something few institutions in history have ever achieved. It replaced the sword with the cross, not to end conquest, but to refine it. Where Roman legions had once marched, now bishops did. Where emperors once ruled by decree, now popes ruled by divine right. It was a seamless transition of power, not an end of empire, but its rebirth in religious form. And it worked brilliantly because religion, when properly manipulated, does not ask permission. It doesn't need laws. It installs itself deeper than law, into the identity, into the conscience, into the part of you that whispers in your sleep and trembles at the thought of hell. It creates not just fear, but a sacred duty to obey. And so when the Church declared a king to be divinely appointed, the people bowed, not to the king himself, but to God. Disobedience wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy, heresy, a crime punishable not just by death, but by damnation. But how did they build such a system? How did they engineer something so total, so enduring? It began with text. Scriptures, whether in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or beyond, were never just stories. They were blueprints. And for those in power, they offered the ultimate psychological weapon, absolute truth. Unlike philosophy or debate, religious truth is not open to argument. It is declared immutable, often delivered by messengers of God whose authority can never be questioned. And therein lies its power. Because if you can convince a population that your words are not your own, but God's, then resistance becomes not just dangerous, it becomes spiritually suicidal. And so, the scriptures were carefully curated, edited, translated, and canonized. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was not a spiritual gathering, it was a political operation. Books were accepted or rejected based not on divine revelation, but on how well they served the empire's interests. Gospels that encouraged rebellion or independence, gone. Doctrines that emphasized personal connection with God, without the need for priests or tithes, buried. The Bible, as we know it, was stitched together like armor, not to protect the soul, but to protect the institution. The same process occurred across empires. In Islamic history, the Abbasid Caliphate amassed vast libraries and translated philosophical works, but only after filtering them through theological control. The Hadiths, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, were gathered generations after his death, meticulously categorized, but also used to standardize behavior across a vast fractious empire. Religion became the software update for empire, a unifying operating system that transcended tribalism, geography, even language. And the rulers, the caliphs and sultans, were positioned as both political and spiritual leaders, unquestionable, sanctified, eternal. And where text was not enough, imagery took over. In medieval Europe, most of the population couldn't read. So the church employed a different medium, fear. Stained glass windows showed the torments of hell in vivid color. Gothic cathedrals loomed over cities like sentinels, reminding citizens of their cosmic insignificance. Every detail, the ringing Bells, the incense. The Latin chants was engineered to overwhelm the senses and cement the idea that the church was not of this world. It was above it. And those who disobeyed, whether by thought, word, or deed, would burn forever. That idea, eternal punishment, was the masterstroke. No empire, no army, no secret police can control a person's thoughts 24/7. But fear of hell? That's internal surveillance. It turns every man into his own warden, every woman into her own judge. It does the work of tyranny without the need for a tyrant. You confess your sins not because someone caught you, but because your own conscience convicts you. You tithe your wages not because you're taxed, but because you believe your soul depends on it. And for those who dared challenge the system, they were erased. The Cathars in southern France believed in a pure form of Christianity that rejected the church's wealth and corruption. They were exterminated in a brutal crusade. The Gnostics believed that divine knowledge came from within, not through priests. Their texts were buried in the desert, only rediscovered centuries later. Scientists like Giordano Bruno, who suggested the stars might be suns with their own planets, burned alive. Even Galileo, forced to recant his belief in heliocentrism, was silenced under threat of torture. This wasn't spiritual debate. This was information control. But perhaps the darkest part of this weaponization of religion was its use in colonization. When European powers set out to conquer the world, they brought not just swords and ships, but missionaries. These were not simply preachers of peace. They were the ideological front line of empire. In the Americas, native religions were declared demonic, sacred texts burned, priests slaughtered, entire cultures erased under the banner of salvation. In Africa, tribes were divided not just by borders, but by conversions, Christian versus Muslim, pagan versus believer. The result was not just spiritual genocide, it was permanent fragmentation. And yet, even in modern times, the machinery continues. Today, the language of religion is used not just in churches or mosques, but in politics, in business, even in war. Presidents end speeches with "God bless." Militants invoke divine will. Laws are passed not on logic, but on sacred tradition. And still, the old tactic persists. Convince the people that your rule is not your own, but divinely ordained. And you can rule without end. But why does it work? Because humans crave certainty. In a world of chaos, religion offers order. In a world of mortality, it offers eternity. And for those who understand this, not the mystics or the seekers, but the manipulators, religion becomes a lever, a way to move entire civilizations without lifting a sword. And so, the crypt remains. Beneath every monument of faith, beneath every sacred rite, there is another chamber, a darker one, where decisions were made not in prayer, but in strategy, where doctrines were crafted not by prophets, but by politicians. And the saddest part, most of those who followed, who believed, were sincere. Their faith was real. Their love of the divine pure. They did not know they were being used, that they still don't. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that the deepest forms of control do not look like chains. They look like salvation. They sound like hymns. They feel like truth, but they are not. They are cages. Beautiful, glowing cages built from verses and rituals and fear. In the next section, we'll step from the crypt into the tower to uncover how secret societies, hidden schools, and ancient orders use this very system to carve out power behind the veil of God, and how those threads lead directly into the modern elite. In the hushed halls of elite universities, in candlelit chambers beneath city cathedrals, and behind the gilded facades of global diplomacy, they gather, not to govern in the open, but to steer in the shadows, not to serve the will of the people, but to manipulate it. They are the architects of shadows, whispered of in half-forgotten texts and encoded in the margins of suppressed manuscripts. These secret societies are more than clubs, more than old money fraternities. They are the custodians of ancient power bloodlines that believe themselves ordained, chosen, destined to shape the world. Regardless of who occupies thrones or presidencies, their fingerprints are everywhere. On revolutions that spiraled into tyrannies, on stock markets that rose and crashed like marionettes on strings, on wars that began with flags and ended in coffins, fought not for freedom, but for balance sheets and dominion. These aren't merely conspiracies whispered by the paranoid. They are legacies inscribed in stone, encoded in the rituals of powerful dynasties. From the Medici to the Rockefellers, from the Rothschilds to obscure royal bloodlines hiding behind the public face of democracy, they have pulled the levers behind curtains thicker than law, darker than morality. To understand the architecture of this invisible empire, one must first trace the blueprints written in the Latin of Rome, in the riddles of alchemists, and in the vows of secret brotherhoods. The Knights Templar did not vanish. They transmuted. Their symbols were absorbed by Masonic orders, their wealth buried and dispersed, their power reforged into new institutions under new names. Freemasonry became the great veil and outer shell of fraternity, concealing inner rings of elite engineers, keepers of forbidden knowledge and geopolitical intention. Not every Freemason is aware, but the inner circle is precise, generational, and loyal to something far older than constitutions. At the heart of this is the obsession with bloodlines, purity not of race, but of arcane legitimacy. They believe their ancestry traces back to a time before recorded history. The Merovingian bloodline, said to descend from the union of Christ and Mary Magdalene, is often referenced in cryptic symbols within elite enclaves. Whether literal or symbolic, the myth is powerful. It says, "We are not elected, we are ordained." This belief in divine right, in chosen status, allows them to operate above morality. Wars, famines, pandemics, these are not tragedies. They are tools. Steps in a long game of world reordering, often called the Great Work, and the Great Work demands silence. Disobedience is punished not by legal systems, but by financial ruin, disgrace, or death disguised as accident. Journalists who ask too many questions end up suicided. Whistleblowers vanish. Investigators are discredited or quietly bought. The tools of control are vast. The World Bank, the IMF, NATO. These are not only political institutions, they are levers, instruments by which economies are shaped, sovereign nations corralled, and disobedient leaders regime changed. Behind their polished press releases stand men and women whose faces never appear on television, who prefer shadows to spotlights. Education, too, is weaponized. Ivy League institutions, Oxbridge, and the grandes écoles of Europe are less about learning and more about grooming, producing the next generation of stewards for this hidden hierarchy. History is rewritten subtly, not by destroying truth, but by diluting it so that the average person forgets there even was another narrative. The victors of every global conflict are rarely nations, but shadow networks that profit regardless of which side wins. In this ecosystem, presidents and prime ministers are not leaders, but actors reading scripts handed to them behind closed doors. Symbols betray the presence of the architects, the all-seeing eye, the pyramid, the Ouroboros, serpents coiled around rods of medicine, owls hidden in government seals, checkerboard floors beneath cathedrals. These are not mere decorations. They are marks of allegiance, signposts of deeper meaning. They appear in the architecture of Washington, D.C., in Vatican art, and in the United Nations Meditation Room, not one placed accidentally. Every angle, every material, every beam of light engineered to reflect ancient cosmology, esoteric power, and ritual alignment with forces the average citizen no longer even believes in. Who are they, these shadow architects? Are they singular, or factions locked in silent war with each other? Evidence suggests a council disparate bloodlines, united by shared vision, but occasionally divided by strategy. Some speak of the Committee of 300. Others whisper of the Bilderberg Group as their meeting ground, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations. These are not myths. Their rosters are public. What is hidden is the why. Why do the wealthiest, most powerful individuals gather in secret every year, away from cameras, with no minutes recorded? Control is no longer about borders, it's about minds. And minds are shaped through media monopolies, algorithms, and psychological warfare. If the architects once used gunpowder, now they use dopamine. Headlines, hashtags, fear campaigns. Crisis fatigue makes the public numb. Disaster becomes background noise. And while everyone argues over left and right, the architects operate above both, sponsoring both sides, funding chaos and ushering in new solutions to problems they themselves engineered. The Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution. This section of hidden history is not about paranoia, it's about patterns. Patterns repeated across centuries. Empires don't collapse randomly, they are dismantled. Economies don't fail accidentally, they are strangled. Cultures don't die overnight. They are eroded, memory by memory, until only engineered narratives remain. These societies, these sacred bloodlines, do not care about democracy. They see the masses as clay to be molded. And their blueprints are older than any constitution, etched in secret languages passed from master to initiate. But every architecture eventually reveals its cracks. The digital age, ironically created by their own technologies, has begun to leak truths they can't always suppress. Whistleblowers, rogue agents, and ordinary citizens with nothing left to lose have begun to speak, to expose the symbols, the rituals, the geopolitical puppetry. Some are silenced. Others survive just long enough to leave breadcrumbs. The architects fight back, of course, but the illusion is weakening. And when illusions fall, empires tremble. So, when you hear of a financial collapse, ask, who profits? When a politician suddenly dies, ask, who gains? When two nations go to war, ask, who supplied the weapons and the narrative? Because somewhere behind the veil, in rooms you will never enter, decisions are made that determine the fate of billions. Not by presidents, not by parliaments, but by families and fraternities who believe they were born to rule, not by merit, but by mandate. The architects of shadows are real. They do not wear robes or horns. They wear suits. They smile on Time magazine covers. They donate to charity and attend climate summits. But behind the stage lights, their hands are deep in every crisis, every collapse, every conflict. Their goal is not chaos, but controlled chaos, so that out of disorder, they can reshape order in their image. In the next section, we descend even deeper into the codes and symbols that have guided these architects across millennia. From Babylon to Bohemian Grove, from Egyptian temples to Silicon Valley. Because to decode the present, we must read the past not as history, but as prophecy, hidden in plain sight. The blueprint was never destroyed. It was just encrypted. And now it begins to unfold.